Hey everyone, welcome back to the Layback podcast. Joining us today is Austin Marchesani. Probably his most important title is recently engaged. So sorry everyone, he is off the market. He has a lucky fiance waiting for him, but he is an unbelievably smart guy in the pitching world. He spent time with the Angels at Iowa and is recent to Twitter fame with his workload thread that we're going to spend a lot of time on today. That was perfect timing, gave us some fuel to speak on. But with all this, I'm going to pass it over to Austin, let him talk a little bit more about his bio. Austin, thanks a ton for joining us today.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me on. I'm actually currently in Iowa. I am from Iowa. I've been here my whole life, but just quick about kind of my journey. I played baseball growing up. Wasn't great. I played, is what I'll say, in college for a year. I actually blew out on pretty much the first day of practice, and so I got a chance to experience a lot of the behind the scenes stuff when I was hurt in terms of like charting or some of that intro stuff. And from there, just kind of blossomed into some more curiosity on the coaching side. Got into formal coaching, coaching the local high school team after I transferred from my junior college. And from there, I did some like private pitching lessons. And as I kept doing it, just kind of my knowledge and curiosity kept growing. Met some of the right people, which led me to the University of Iowa, being a student manager in their analytics department for a year and a half, which really pretty much set me up for the career trajectory that I currently on. And then from Iowa, was able to be with the Angels for 2 years as a pitching development analyst, and now just doing a lot of consulting work, helping both high school, college, and some professional guys with some throwing programs, some workload stuff like you mentioned, and some pitch design arsenal things. And it's kind of a jack of all trades right now, doing whatever I can to help pitchers develop. But yeah, I'm open book today. I love sharing my story to help inspire anyone because I wasn't a great baseball player, but like I obviously made it to a pretty high level of coaching or job. So I want to help any way I can.
Well, you might have the most humble 88 to 90 story of everyone that I've heard. You said you'll play, you said, in air quotes, which is kind of crazy to me. I think most people that have seen 90 on a radar gun at least feel pretty good about themselves. So I guess that's that good old humble Midwest attitude
Yeah,
sufficient
yeah.
there.
Well, part of it too is credit to the junior college I was at, Kirkwood Community College. We were a machine. We made it to the JUCO World Series the year I was there. We had a guy get drafted, multiple D1 guys, and so even if I was throwing 88 to 90, I probably wouldn't have sniffed the mound very much. So it's a powerhouse program. It still is, and Coach Rima is going to be one of my favorite coaches the rest of my life. He really took the shot on me, and I'm always going to be grateful for that. But they got a pretty good program going on in Cedar Rapids.
So I guess they humbled you. Maybe you should have stayed smaller time so you could have been big fish, little pond, and
Yeah,
you just
well,
never would have been
then
where you are now.
yeah, I was gonna say I'm happy with what I did my journey because who knows where I would have been if that all didn't happen.
For sure. I guess kind of the funny, serendipitous way things work out. I heard on another podcast you did that you were at Northern Iowa, and that's actually where you got connected with Robin Lund.
Yeah, yeah. After I blew out, I transferred to University of Northern Iowa, which is in Cedar Falls, Iowa. That's my hometown. That's where I'm at right now, actually. And I never really thought about coaching, once I got to UNI. So I ended up taking a coding class at UNI, where I just learned to do like modeling and things like that. And so I had to do a final project, getting into like make a model basically. And so I found this website called Baseball Savants that obviously I know very well now. And I got a bunch of baseball data and I was like, this is kind of fun. Maybe I can do something like this with baseball. And so I actually searched the entire college, the whole like statistical department. I was a stats major, so talked to all the professors and they didn't really know how to get into sports analytics. And then was lucky enough to find Robin Lund's name, who was just a professor of kinesiology at UNI for 17 years. He actually has a daughter that was in my grade in high school. So I knew roughly of him, but I got connected with him and he gave me this huge, like, I think it was like 3 or 4 pages of just like, if you want to work in baseball, here's the things you need to know. Here's all these metrics. Here's these conferences you can go to. And I was like, wow, he's on top of it. And I did all of that, and I still have that piece of paper. It sits on my desk as I move, as I go to places, just to remind me of where I started. But as soon as I got to know Robin, I was like, this is going to be a guy in my corner. And then I get a call from him about a month later, and he was like, hey, just letting you know, I just got a job at the University of Iowa. He's a hitting coach, actually, is what he got hired for. And I was like, wow, I didn't know that was coming. Professor to D1 baseball coach doesn't happen too often, but him being in my corner as I was at Iowa with him, and then as he moved to the Tigers, he's been an awesome resource for me and helping me grow in my career.
For sure. So then when you went to Iowa, it was as a grad student, correct?
Yep. Grad student. I did a master's program there in analytics, but again, kind of the big focus for me was working in their student manager program. They send a bunch of guys to pro ball jobs. And again, kind of just like anyone that's listening to this, if you want to get a job in pro ball, Iowa is the place to go. They have tools, resources. It's a front office. It is a MLB front office run at a college level. Single-handedly help get that job, but it's any student that's there, and it is the best experience that I had my whole college career. And so I can't recommend that enough. And the last thing with that is like the coaches completely buy into what these managers are doing. Analysts, even the on field, there's video and scouting. Like there's departments, and Coach Rick Heller, like he trusts the analysts. All the assistant coaches trust the analysts. They have just as much power as the coaches do in terms of giving their opinions. And that really got my foot in the door and gave me a lot of confidence, especially going into the job market with MLB teams to really feel good about what I knew and my knowledge could translate to that highest level.
So shout out Iowa baseball managers, big time. I do want to kind of stick on that theme for a little bit. What was your first major project that you took on? So beyond this one that you did for the coding class,
Yeah.
when you got to Iowa and you were trying to make a difference for the first time, what did you look into? Were you assigned something or did you have a passion project right off the jump?
And I'll say before I go into that is that's the nice thing about what they do at Iowa is if you have something you're passionate about, they let you do it. If not, I mean, when I was there, obviously Robin had hundreds of ideas every day that he would just spill out and you could choose one. But really the biggest thing that got me on the map, you could say, is I researched dead zone fastballs. So
Okay.
dead zone being equal vertical and horizontal break. We had a pitcher that his name was Duncan Davitt. He's in the Rays organization now. He had a dead zone fastball by the movement profile, but he performed really well. And so Robin had kind of wondered, why is this happening? And so I did a lot of research on can you work with a dead zone fastball and found a lot of things on if you have obviously above average velocity at plays or a unique release. Got into some vertical approach angle stuff and some things that are common knowledge now. But the stigma when I was going through it 4 or 5 years ago is just if you have a dead zone fastball, you're kind of screwed. Which we know now it's like that's not the case at all, depending on your release characteristics or even velocity. And so that's really the big one that got me started. And then the other one that I'm kind of known for or brought up a lot is I helped build the Stuff Plus model at Iowa, which is used very widely. It's still used to this day, which again, myself and Connor Curtis, who is going to work for the Brewers after he graduates, like he is a whiz, but that was a big project. That was the biggest project probably I've ever done, including my time with the Angels. And so that was really helpful with just statistical knowledge, and that was applicable right away. I can't tell you how many different uses we had for that in pitch design and scouting, and there's countless different uses for it, but those were really the two big ones that kind of stuck out for me.
I feel like you laid out a fork in the road, and I want to talk both about dead zone fastballs as well as stuff plus models.
Mhm.
Sadly, the way my brain works is I'm probably going to go down one path and completely forget about the other one until
That's
like
all good.
3 hours after we finish recording, and then I'm going to be like, oh shoot, I need to call him. But the one you brought up first was dead zone fastballs. Sounds like some of that was influenced by what Robin was interested in.
Mhm.
But if we can spend some more time on that theme, what are you now seeing that differentiates what you might have originally thought was a dead zone fastball versus what actually is? I know you highlighted really quickly VAA,
Yeah.
different release characteristics, or things like that. So, what or how can someone just identify a dead zone fastball that won't
Yeah.
necessarily play?
That's a really good question. And I actually wrote a follow-up. It was the last blog I did at Iowa to like a part two of the dead zone and something that is still my answer for this question, which is arm slot data is now available on Baseball Savant. So we didn't have arm slot data when I was at Iowa. We had TrackMan data that just release height, release side. But I kind of made a pseudo arm angle metric from that. And so what I did was I looked at movement of the fastball compared to arm angle. And the more that deviates, the better results you could say. So in other words, your dead zone fastball is going to be dependent on your arm slot. A guy that has a really high arm slot, more north and south, if their fastball has more rise, it's going to be more of a dead zone because the hitter expects the ball to kind of stay in the plane. If a guy's straight side armor, they're going to expect the ball to go more east-west. We're seeing that a lot with public projects on Twitter that are discovering that with Savant data, but that's something that 4 years ago. I wrote that in my second Dead Zone blog. If you have a movement profile that differs from where your arm slot is, and you can even expand it to just like generally look at where your arm slot is. If the ball doesn't follow that plane your arm is on, you probably have some unique characteristics, or you wouldn't be a dead zone guy. To put it at the very, lowest level, if you have no tech available, that's something that you can very easily identify. But again, to this day, I would say that unexpected movements, kind of what I call it, where your arm slot is plays a huge role in what the hitter perceives as what's going to happen with your fastball. So the more that your ball moves different from what the hitter is used to or what they perceive might happen, the better the results are going to be. And if you stick in that category of it moves exactly like what hitters are used to seeing, that would be the dead zone. It has much less to do with the strictly movement, vertical and horizontal numbers.
I'm sure stemming off of this is part of the Arsenal design concept of why certain maybe hand position biases, or from our side of things with Flex Pro Grip, finger pressure biases can result in more favorable Arsenal potentials, as
Mhm.
in Shred released that big thing maybe a month ago now, where I think Tyler Zombro broke down the different typical pitches that go along with a certain pronation or supination
Yep.
bias or amount, or on our side, like an index or middle finger bias
Sure.
from what we're seeing with Flex Pro Grip, which thankfully this is starting to tie into Stuff Plus. So now I kind of see how you went down this path. I guess thanks for opening this door. I thought it was
Yeah.
a fork in the road, but they intersect
Yeah.
again.
No, that was my plan the
Um,
whole time.
Good. Yeah, you nailed it then. You're the perfect guest. So when we're looking at these fastball deviations where
Mhm.
it's transitioning from a dead zone to a potentially more effective fastball or an unexpected fastball, is that initial fastball movement what you're using for additional arsenal design? Where are you going with the next step for designing an arsenal?
Off of the fastball you're asking?
Or is it the fastball that you even start with?
Yeah, I mean, in my case, a lot of the time it was the fastball that I started with simply because, and this baseball shifting away from this, which I completely agree with, but most of the time your fastball is going to be your most thrown pitch. And so if you look at the numbers, fastballs typically perform the worst out of any pitch as well. And so if we're going to throw a pitch a lot, but it doesn't perform good, we're still going to try to maximize the value that we can get out of that. So again, getting out of that dead zone was kind of the number one way that we found to maximize performance of those pitches. And that could be again from a lot of different ways to change that dead zone profile in terms of like spin axis, just getting more backspin from a lower slot can help make it flatter, or some seam shifted weight characteristics to improve sink or even rise. There's a lot of different ways you can go with it. But the main driver was strictly just how can we improve the fastball performance if we're going to throw it this much? And again, now that orbs are throwing non-fastballs more than fastballs, which again I'm a huge fan of. If it's your best pitch, throw it more. I think that you can design a lot off of that fastball kind of deviation. But in my opinion, everything starts with the fastball because that's kind of your baseline characteristics with the biases that you talked about with supination, pronation. Everything kind of works off of that, and the video from Tread explained it really well. There's not a lot you can do differing wise based on how your biases are. And so that's really why I think we spent a lot of time with the fastball. It's just if you're going to throw it a lot, it better be a decent pitch. Otherwise, you're going to get hammered, and then you're going to have to rely on a lot of other stuff. And so setting up that foundation, I think, is going to help expand your arsenal, and you'll get into other stuff plus pitches. But and I'll say it again, I know I've repeated it a lot, but like you have to just set up that fastball in order to be able to perform at a decent level. For very few pitchers, their fastball is going to be their best pitch, but as long as it's serviceable, a lot of the other options in their arsenal play off. And depending on your Stuff Plus model, the movement of your fastball can be a factor in it, or it could not, depending on how the model's built. But there's a lot that can be taken into account with just strictly getting away from that dead zone.
Before I move on to the next question, and you bring up fastball and the importance of it, one thing that I try to remind people when I have these conversations, and I'd be curious to hear your opinion on it. If we look at an entire lifetime of throws made by a single individual, beyond even what you're doing in game, every single throw that you have ever made in your life, and we break down the pitch type, I'm going to assume that no less than 97% of every throw that you have made in your entire life has been some form of a fastball.
No doubt.
Yeah, whether it's a four seam grip, two seam grip, I don't care. You have probably thrown a fastball way closer to the majority of the pitches you have ever thrown in your life than closer to 75%. It's
Yeah.
probably way
And
closer to 100.
and then, this isn't a conversation for now, but that's a huge unlock for a lot of guys. Like, hey, you're throwing 30 pitches on your recovery days and you're throwing all just fastballs, but you're just holding the grip normally. You have 100 recovery days throughout the year. That's 3,000 pitches that you're wasting just throwing fastball. Like, I'm not saying you're going to get a ton better by throwing lower intent, but you can get better feel, you can get more comfortable. Like, there's a lot of different things you can do. But you're absolutely right. I mean, 97% sounds like a pretty good number. It's just not worked on a lot in terms of other pitches, and you just kind of been always accepted. I'm playing catch, just throw fastballs when there's a lot of value in throwing things other than fastballs in terms of not just working on shapes, but just comfortability and some other different things. So I love that point.
So maybe that's just a little development unlock there or a little takeaway that somebody could have even from the conversation that we're running through now. Take time to throw other pitches.
Yeah.
It's that simple. You can probably spare backing down from throwing 97% fastball in your life.
Yep.
Because you throw 97% fastball in your life, why does it then make sense to go into a game when you're throwing 50% fastball?
And we're going to talk about my workload thread, but I forgot who it was. Someone replied and said, does throwing off speed have an impact? And my answer to the workload question strictly was not necessarily. Workload is more just about the total kind of foundation that you lay, but you still have to kind of on-ramp those non-fastball options. If you just play catch with your fastball for the first 6, 10 weeks of your on-ramp, and then you're throwing bullpens, and the first time you hold your changeup grip is when you're off the mound, like that's not set up very good. You're going to be really behind. And so, in terms of, like I said, comfortability, there's a huge gap that I think baseball community has to really improve that feel. And there's no data I have to back this up, but I feel like the more comfortable you are, the more, and I don't want to say accurate, but just like you have more confidence in it. When you throw it, whether it's accurate or not, the more confidence you have in a pitch, I think is better for a pitcher regardless of the situation.
Generally, comfortability is going to lead to confidence. There's no
Exactly.
question those two things are linked. It is funny you bring that up. I know we talked about this off air, but that was Lance Brozdowski who
Yeah.
responded. Trust me, I mined through your thread in the comments. Maybe someone else said it too, but it's nice that we have a little Lance Brozdowski callback. He's getting mentioned more and more, and his time's coming on the podcast. At some point, I got to catch him before spring training kicks off.
Lance is one of the best guys in the public sphere out there. The work he does is just incredible, and the time he puts in, he is doing a lot of good for the game.
Big time. I do want to comment on that breaking ball concept or the
Mhm.
change up and introducing that into your preseason workload or your acute to chronic workload ratio and the ramp up that you're going through. Maybe this was an undertone that you intended anyways, but something that I want to call out is beyond just gaining comfort from a performance aspect. If you haven't introduced more supination bias pitches in your season on ramp, and the first time you go to rip a cutter or slider is when you're at full intent on a mound, you might not think of it as dangerous or something of
Yeah,
that nature. I don't want to label it necessarily dangerous, but that is
it's a
a
different
different
stress.
stress. Yeah, exactly. You
Yeah,
jinx. But it is a completely different stress. And because it is a greater stress on the supination. You're delaying the pronation of your arm, the way it works. You're changing the kinematics of your sequence. And something that we have found, if you are gripping a supinated pitch or trying to throw a supinated pitch, that pitch then puts you in a position of greater supination at maximum layback as well. And with that, we have found that the muscle tendon units that can support the UCL when they are in supination cannot produce as much force as if they were in a neutral or pronated position. And what is super interesting is that is not the case as much for individuals that would be classified as quote unquote supinators because they have spent more time in supination for their entire lives. But let's say you are a more like traditional pitcher that throws a carry four seam fastball or like more like natural arm side movement and you struggle to get anything to go glove side, but you get introduced to this new slider grip or something, or somebody tells you a sweeper is going to change everything you do, that pitch is going to be more stressful than what you are used to because of the supination demands that you are not accustomed to. So everything Austin said about introducing those kind of throws at lower stress levels early on is going to make it easier the deeper you get into your ramp up.
Yeah, and I trust you on this. With the data that I have, I haven't been able to firmly place that with the workload numbers, but I have. But if there's anyone that has done the research, I know it's going to be you guys. And but intuitively, like you said, it makes sense. You don't want to start introducing that stress when you're at the highest intent of throwing off the mound when you've been throwing for 6 to 10 weeks and you haven't touched any sort of those other stressors that you're going to have. It's just it makes a lot of sense intuitively, and you guys have the numbers to back that. So it's for sure something that a lot of pitchers are kind of missing in a lot of their development plans.
And I guess this is a little bit of a shameless plug. Yeah, Austin said the data. This is a study that we have coming out here in the next few months. We partnered on research with this with Dylan Newcomer, who's the physical therapist out at Driveline, as well as Dr. Matt Fury, who's an orthopedist down in Baton Rouge, and Dr. Gunnar Brolinson and the Virginia Tech sports medicine team. So we have a lot coming out on this. If anybody wants to hear more about it, Daryl and I did an episode together, probably shoot, I don't know, 15 to 20 episodes ago now. I don't know what number it is, so I can't call it out specifically, but Daryl and I run through the research we have coming down the line. But we're going to go back to focusing on Austin here, and I did want to make the transition to the Stuff Plus model. And we talked about fastballs, we talked about arsenal design, then we went on this really fun diatribe about introducing pitches at different times.
Yeah.
But I'm not super educated when it comes to Stuff Plus models. I think they're really cool and I think they're useful, but I don't understand fully how they are built. What I think I know, and I could be grossly wrong, so feel free to tell me,
For
is
sure.
that there's generally some sort of, I don't necessarily want to say biasing built into it, but Stuff Plus models can be built different ways, so they weight different pitches differently.
That is absolutely true.
Okay, great. So now I don't know if this is a trade secret for the Iowa Stuff Plus model, or maybe if you just want to talk more generally about where Stuff Plus models differ and what they might weight more strongly or more weakly in different regards. But I would love to go down that path.
Yeah, I will start with general stuff plus models. So like most MLB teams and then the public data that's available. Are you familiar with like run value, the kind of different run value states?
I would say probably slightly more than the average individual just because I
Okay.
love this stuff,
So
but
yeah.
nowhere close to getting an analytics job.
So basically if you break it down on a pitch by pitch level, you have a batter up with a certain base state, certain count, and certain number of outs. You throw a pitch. If it's a ball, it changes your run expectancy because the count will change. If it's a strike, it changes your run expectancy to probably less. And so that change in run expectancy on the pitch level, and obviously if it's put into play and it's a home run, your run expectancy is going to go way up. Like all of those changes in run value, that is what traditional Stuff Plus models on the MLB side are trained on. That is public data that's on Baseball Savant. MLB teams can use that. There's a lot of different ways you can use that, but that is traditionally what you're trying to predict with a Stuff Plus model is when I throw this pitch, what is the best possible situation in terms of getting a negative run value? Because for pitchers, you want to lower that run value. So that is what traditional Stuff Plus models are built on. What I can say for Iowa is that TrackMan does not give you change in run value. So the biggest challenge we had when I was helping build it at Iowa was that we had to come up with what are we actually trying to predict? Because a lot of the college Stuff Plus models you see are actually just models that are predicting like whiff or something. Again, and those are very valuable models, but I think a Stuff Plus model can take into account more than just whiff. There's a lot of different ways to get positive results. Ground balls, weak contact, whatever you value. So without giving the special sauce at Iowa, because I truly believe it is the best Stuff Plus model in college baseball and probably beats some MLB team Stuff Plus model. We had to combine a lot of different aspects that either Iowa valued or we saw generalized in the college trends. Here is what leads to success, not just getting with, obviously a part of it, but whatever else that we kind of cook together and combine that into one number. And then that's what we use to predict. And so that was really challenging and why college Stuff Plus models are very hard to come by because the run scoring environment in college is obviously different than pro ball. And that's getting into your actual question with some biases. Completely depends on the run environment too. College, to MLB to even like high school, if you want to go there, is going to be completely different in terms of like what produces positive results. Where when you get to a lower level like high school, velocity is probably going to be valued a lot more because you can get away with just strictly throwing hard in high school, regardless of shapes or anything. Obviously, when you get to college, the hitters are better. Then highest level at MLB, they're going to be fastballs. Velo really doesn't matter unless you're Ben Joyce and you're throwing 105. It's like it really depends on what's going on. So I would say the overarching theme that I see in a lot of stuff plus models is just like whether you realize it or not, there's some degree of overfitting. And what I mean by overfitting is it fits specifically the kind of data you use to train the model instead of generalizing what's happening in the real world. So when you build a model, you have separate data that you use to train your model, and then you have normally data that you use to kind of test it out. And the goal of building a model is not to fit your test data the best. There's certain metrics, and we're not going to get into that with this. That's not what the podcast is about. But there's certain metrics that you can check to see how well are you actually fitting your data. That's not the goal of a Stuff Plus model. And maybe this is just my opinion, but I think it's pretty accepted. Your goal is to explain in general what happened in the environment in the MLB or high school or college, whatever you're building for. And so a lot of teams just try to fit what's going on in the actual data that they have instead of generally what trends do we see. In a very simple example, like if you look at actually velocity numbers for like an MLB Stuff Plus model, it'll show that the people that throw really slow are actually really good. But that's just something called survivorship bias, which means if you throw slow in the MLB, you're probably going to be pretty successful. Otherwise, you're not going to be in the MLB. So again, a very simple example there, but just that's one of the examples of biases of fitting your data very, very specifically instead of trying to generalize. Here's the overall trend that we see.
Okay.
I know
Love
that
it.
was a lot. I know that was a
No,
ton
no.
of factors.
I love this. And there was a small part of me that wanted to tell you to shut up when you said this isn't the goal of the podcast. I'm like, we'll go full bore analytics podcast if you want to, because you've got me cooking a little bit now. Maybe a more specific question. Let's take a slight step back and maybe lighten the air a little bit from a like in-depth analytics discussion. Maybe if you can give an example of how two different models could assess the same slider or something. You have a ton of familiarity with Brody Brecht, who
Mhm.
throws the living piss out of the baseball, and as
Yeah,
a result was throwing what's his the gyro slider thing, 92 miles an hour or
for
something like
sure.
that. I'd assume some models probably grade that out as the single best pitch in baseball, and some probably grade it out as like a
Yeah.
slightly above average pitch.
Yeah, so I'll use that exact example and explain probably the biggest difference that I see among like really sophisticated models and some of the simpler ones that, again, both have their places. So again, with Brody's example, he throws a four seam that's upper 90s, reaches triple digits, and then a gyro slider that's, like I said, really hard, 92. Just side note, like watching him pitch in person is maybe the single greatest experience I've had, maybe besides watching Ben Joyce throw a pen. Both of those two just electric. But in terms of Brody's stuff and how that can be seen differently with the slider, it depends on the inputs of the model. So what's going into the model, starting with how it would be graded as the best pitch in baseball. If you just take in a vacuum, you're throwing a slider 92 miles an hour, that the gyro slider, that's just a nasty pitch. Just looking at someone throws a pitch that's 92 that has an inch of glove side sweep or whatever it is, and then 0 inches of induced vertical break. That's just a nasty pitch. That is great. I think that one's pretty self-explanatory. You can just see that's a really good pitch. Where you get into how that could be an average to above average pitch is if you start to take in other characteristics of the arsenal. So with Brody's example, if you compare that with differentials between his fastball velocity and his fastball movement, if he's throwing the slider 92, he's throwing his fastball 98. That's a 6 mile an hour difference. That's not a ton. What you actually see with some breaking pitches and off speed pitches is the bigger that velo differential, the more success that you find in terms of whiff or some of these other things. And so for a breaking ball that would be 6 miles an hour off of a fastball, that's not a great velocity difference between the two. And some stuff models don't like that as much. They want to see more of like an 8 to 10 mile an hour difference for a gyro slider. The other thing too is like fastball movement. If you have, and again, I haven't seen Brody's movement profile in a bit, but I think he doesn't have a ton of rise on his fastball. So let's say, it's 15 inches or whatever, and his slider's at 0. That's still a decent vertical differential, but It could be more. It could have more depth to it. It could have even more sweep or whatever it is. And you can get into velocity sweep trade-offs. But if you compare things to the fastball, and that's how you grade other pitches with movement differentials and velocity differentials, it could be seen as, well, yeah, it's a really good pitch if you just look at the pitch. But if you compare it to his fastball, it's not that much of a difference compared to if it's a little bit slower, maybe trade some movement, it will grade better because it's predicting more whiff or more positive results. And that's the biggest example of two pitches or one pitch being graded vastly different based on how the model is input. And that's what I see, like I said, a lot with sophisticated models is they compare it to fastball because that's again your primary pitch for a lot of guys. And then what it kind of does off of the fastball. So you can extrapolate that to an East-West pitcher using like an Angels, former Angels pitcher, I guess, Jimmy Herget, very much like two seam that goes this way, and he has a huge sweeper that grades well in some stuff models because it's like a huge east-west differential versus if you just look in a vacuum. And again, a sweeper moves a ton, but it's not super hard. Maybe it's not graded as much. So I really think a lot of that can come down to just what are the inputs, especially is it comparing it to the fastball or the primary pitch that they throw, or is it just looking at the pitch in the vacuum? And there's some pretty big differences. And so, especially if you're looking on Twitter and some of these other people that are doing public models, they're all great. They're all doing great work, but that's really why you see some of these kind of drastic differences between specific pitch types.
Thank you so freaking much. I can't begin to express my debt of gratitude for you explaining Stuff Plus models and the differences that occur between them.
It's
That
hard.
was
It's
huge.
really hard to kind of get an understanding. And obviously, like I've done it before. That's why I know, more than most people. But for someone that's just looking at it, if they see Brody Brecht's slider's a 102 Stuff Plus, and then someone else has it as a 170, it's like, what's going on here? Is it just, can we not trust either of these? And so a lot of it just depends on, like I said, the model inputs and finding, a lot of people do good work on documenting, what's going on with their models and how they built it. But it's really important to just know what's going into it and what you value. Because maybe I just value what is the pitch itself. Maybe you value how it plays off of the fastball, and that's the model you use. And there's nothing wrong with using either one of them. It just goes back to kind of the individuality of your beliefs and what you value as an organization.
I think one more surface level thing to hit on here. You said in that example, scoring at a 102 versus a 174. And
Yeah.
if I'm not mistaken, the points above or below 100 is the percent above or below the replacement level or average level pitch, correct? Or something
Again,
like
that,
that.
that also depends on the model
Oh,
build. In
okay.
general, I think most people that is true. I know for Iowa's, we adjusted it a little bit where we controlled the standard deviation. So one standard deviation above the average would be 25 points. So like a 125 would be roughly 70th percentile pitch. And then a 150 would be 90th. And then you keep going up from there.
Okay.
But I think most public models have a little bit tighter of a window. So like again, it's not exactly right, but in general, if you want to say it's 10% better, that's not too far off, just to put it very simply.
Okay. Well, again, this helped tremendously. Hopefully, people listening feel the same because this has been eye-opening for me. Also, you make me feel a lot better about one of my single favorite pitchers to watch of all time. You spoke of Brody Brecht and then Ben Joyce and watching those guys throw live. There's a guy who's now with the White Sox, Jairo Iriarte. I watched him throw in the minors when he was with the Padres, and what he could do with the baseball was unbelievable. And for example, he threw this weird changeup thing at like 89 to 92, and mostly like 90 to 92. And his fastball is 94, 95,
Yeah.
96. So, like, really poor differential velo wise. And his changeup kind of behaved as if it was a left-handed gyro slider as a righty.
Yeah.
So like not a ton of horizontal. It was more like dart. It was really good. He performed really well with it. And
Yeah.
then every time I went to go look at analytics or anything, no models liked his changeup.
Yeah.
And I didn't
That's a good
understand
point.
why.
And that's kind of something I haven't really touched on, but the models are built on previous data, right? So if that pitch isn't thrown, you don't have righties throwing that type of pitch. the model doesn't really know what to base that off of historically. It's kind of, like I said, extrapolating is taking your data and applying it or predicting it based on something that the model hasn't really seen or your training data hasn't seen. So just because the numbers say it doesn't work, it's like Tyler Rogers. There's not that many historical pitchers that have the movement profile that he does. So a lot of the time, his stuff plus grades are either like extreme ends. They're either 250 or they're negative. So, and again, it's not really good or really bad. It's just there's no historical data to go off of it. And so that's a really good example of, again, like you can't just judge stuff plus for how good a pitch is. In general, there's a lot more context that can be taken into account, especially if it's kind of that unicorn pitch or outlier. And you bring up that story, just brings up one more that I have to bring up with Ben Joyce, because my first year with the Angels, one of the spring training games, they played Team USA when they were doing the World Baseball Classic. And Ben Joyce threw a like slider to Pete Alonso, and he was throwing 103 that day or whatever. And I think the slider was like 78. It was just like 25, 30 miles an hour. Like it was more of like a sweeper type shape. It was, oh man, you got to look up the video. It was one of the funniest things I've seen. And it was 2 feet outside, but Alonso still swung at it. He struck out. It was one of my favorite memories. But we all just kind of looked at it like, that's like 30 miles an hour off of this fastball he's just throwing, which again, some models are going to be like, wow, I hate that. And some models are going to be like, wow, that's a great pitch. But it was fun to see for sure.
This, like I said, has been eye-opening. I appreciate all the personal stories and then just the general talk on Stuff Plus models. But that probably feels like a pretty good spot to tie up the super nerdy discussions
Hmm.
of analytics, Stuff Plus. Now, maybe we should get into the weeds on workload management, which I know you're super passionate about.
Let's do it.
Okay. You recently posted a thread, a very timely one, about guys throwing over winter break and what days off can do to your acute to chronic workload. We've
Hmm.
had Casey Mulholland on the podcast to talk about workload. Dylan Newcomer has talked about workload and especially using Pulse. I like to think the audience should be pretty educated on this, so feel free to get as in the weeds as you want to with the topic.
Perfect. Love it. I love talking about it.
Good. Yeah, even if you just want to go verbal tweet to start and talk about the project you took on, what you looked at, and the data you presented, I think that
Yeah.
would be great.
For sure. So right now I'm working with a lot of just individual pitchers on throwing programs. Some of them are high schoolers in Iowa. Some of them are high schoolers not in Iowa. Some of them are college, even some professional. And so there's a lot of different timelines on like when you need to be ready, where obviously spring training for a lot of guys is going to be earlier. And then high school baseball starts in the spring. And then something unique, I don't even know if you know this, high school baseball in Iowa is actually in the summer. And so like for the guys that I'm working high school in Iowa, we still have like 5 months until they're even starting practice, which is a weird concept. But as I'm doing this, I just write throwing programs. I use the driveline pulse sensors. And so with the workload number you get each day, obviously it's a sum of the total number of throws and the intensity of each of those throws combined into one number. I had a lot of different people that were texting me like, "Hey, I'm going on vacation this week for Christmas or whatever." Whatever the case was, they were going to miss some days. And I am a big proponent of if you need to miss days or you're going on vacation, I'm never going to tell you, no, you can't go on vacation. I always give everyone Christmas off. Like I'm not a monster. But not a lot, but there's some guys that are like, I'm going to be in Costa Rica for 10 days. I was like, okay, what actually happens if you go to Costa Rica and you don't pick up a baseball? Does that have as big of an impact as in my mind it has? And I'm like, you're going to miss 10 days of your throwing program. And so all I did was I took my current throwing program and I have a base template that I use where there's like 2 light days, 2 medium days, and 2 heavy days, and then you get a complete off day in there. And so I just took that exact program and then I just copied it out however far, 5, 6 months in advance. And one of those heavy days is like a bullpen day, and one of them is like a live or really heavy day. And so with the heaviest day, I would increase the workload a little bit to simulate the on-ramp that we would normally do as you're going into the season. And so the actual point of the tweet was at different chronic workloads. So chronic workload, again, is like your long-term, what you built up for over the last 28 days. Once you reached a certain chronic workload, and I did this from, I believe it was 8 through 12 or something like that, I would basically just then stop and put zeros for two, three, four, five, all the way through 10 days in a row and see what happens to your chronic. Does it crash? Does it stay the same? Can you leave it afloat for a little bit? And basically, what I found is once you get past like 3 or 4 off days in a row, it takes at least 10 days to build back up to the spot that you were previously. So, in the context of most people right now, they're on ramping, they are continuing to grow. If you take days off, not only are you going to stop your on ramp, but you're going to go down in your chronic workload and you're going to have to spend 10 days just getting to that same point and then be able to continue to move up. And so, really, and I didn't put this on the tweet, but it'll take 3 to 4 weeks just to get back to a suitable point in your on ramp to get feeling comfortable for where you're going to be heading into the season. And the last thing I'll say is generalizing, the more fit you were, so the further into your on ramp you got, the higher your chronic ratio was, or your chronic workload, excuse me, the more detrimental it was when you took days off, which again, intuitively makes sense. The more in shape you are, the worse it's going to be when you take days off. And a lot of people, it's hard to explain at first, but when I use the lifting example, it clicks for a lot of people. Like if you're lifting and you take 10 days off, you can't just go into the weight room and a lot of the time throw on whatever you had for squat and you're doing it easy, right? You have to continue to work at it. It's the same with throwing, which shocks a lot of people when I say it, and maybe it's just the younger kids I work with. But when you don't throw, it takes just as much time. And then when you miss just that high intensity day, like your really big push day, it basically screws you up for 2 months. I mean, it'll take you like 3 to 4 weeks just to get back to your level, and then another 3 to 4 weeks to continue to on ramp. And so, kind of the two overall themes was like, don't skip more than 3 days in a row if you want to at least maintain where you're at. And if you skip more than a week, you are at least a month and a half behind where you were previously just by skipping 7 days. And so that was kind of the biggest takeaway because pro guys, I get it's a little bit easier because that's their job, but especially high school and college kids that are on break, it's really easy to skip throwing. You're with your friends, or especially if you're in college, you go back, you see your high school friends or whatever. It can be really detrimental. And it's one of the scariest times as a college coach. When we were at Iowa, that was always the scariest thing, sending these guys home, not knowing what's going to happen if they're going to continue to throw. Luckily, we were using Pulse, so we could count on that. But for people that don't have Pulse or they can't rely on it too much, it's a scary feeling sending these guys away for basically a month and not knowing where they're going to be, knowing when they come back, you have 3 weeks, maybe a month before they start playing games. And so hopefully it just opened up some eyes and had a lot of good feedback on it. And I did a follow up, which we can, talk about a little bit more when you just throw lightly. But overall, like I just wanted to get the word out that throwing any amount is better than not throwing and taking skip days. Even if you're in Costa Rica, you can still get throwing in on the beach. Like that would be awesome to do for one, but you can fit throwing in and it takes you 5 to 10 minutes, even if you're just doing a light day. But skipping and throwing is just detrimental to a lot of guys in ways they don't realize.
You said it's seemingly intuitive. I think that is worth spending a little bit of time on in the sense that it isn't that surprising to me when somebody says like, "Oh, well, I've been throwing so much. I've been so good about my on-ramp, so I can take time off because I've built up so much to get to this point." And then the example you gave was perfect when you talk about either sprinting or weightlifting, because that's the equivalent stress level that we're dealing with here.
Hmm.
Throwing is an incredibly stressful thing. Yes, it would be a little bit different if you, whatever, were just throwing BP for a living. You took time off. You could go back to throwing BP after taking 10 days off. In fact, it would probably feel pretty good. But if your mission is to throw baseballs as hard as you can and do it for 5, 6 innings a month from now or something, 2 months from now, taking any days off is super detrimental because, yes, you did not expose yourself to the stresses that you need to get accustomed to handle the environment that you want to throw in.
Yeah, yeah, that's exactly right. And the other thing with this whole thread is I just assumed when you started throwing again, you were just, rejoining your college program and just on whatever schedule they are. In reality, that's still not going to be very healthy for you. When you talk about your acute to chronic ratio, if you take those days off and you just continue to do what your, program is doing when you come back, you're still going to have these spikes that Casey Mulhan would call them, they're unhealthy still. Again, it's not like you're going to get hurt automatically, but you're still getting into these unhealthy zones. So when we talk about if you skip throwing and then you properly on ramp without these big spikes in ACR, it's going to take even more time to do that. And so not only, again, does it take longer to actually get onto that same level as your peers or teammates, it's going to take a lot of time just to avoid those spikes if you really want to do it in a healthy manner, which is something completely, I didn't even talk about in the thread. But the avoiding those spikes when you take your acute, which is like your weekly average roughly, and then your chronic, like if you take those days off, your acute's going to be really high when you get back, and your chronic's not going to be as high. So you're going to get those big spikes where you're doing too much in the recent weeks versus what you've been built up for. And again, that's the same thing, spelling disaster, just as much as taking days off. And so I could have done a whole nother thread on the importance of that and how long it would actually take for a proper ramp up. But these people just are not throwing enough, in my experience, to really understand what this healthy on ramp is. But when they do it right, I've gotten so much feedback this year of like, I've thrown more than I ever have, but my arm feels the best it's ever been. And it's like, it's not a coincidence. Most of the time, people are concerned about overthrowing. But in reality, it's the underthrowing that does a lot of damage for guys, especially early on in the season. And I know that's something that Casey has talked about a lot and he's very passionate about, but it just makes sense. And I have the data to back that up, that it is just paramount that you get your throwing in and establish that base, that foundation before you really start to on ramp.
Yeah, I'm glad you reiterated that. It is extremely important to recognize that often our enemy is not throwing too much, it's throwing too little. So then the time you do get exposed to what gets considered extreme pitch counts, you just weren't prepared for.
Hmm.
And people should probably have the forethought to recognize that this 14-year-old was not capable of throwing 120 pitches. But in theory, if that's what we trained for, they should be okay. At least that's what the
Yep.
models would say. Or they would be better prepared for that experience. Not saying it would be all hunky dory and perfect. Like, I don't know if any 14-year-old should throw that much. But in theory, if you are exposed to that stress gradually over time, you get more comfortable enduring it.
Yeah, yeah, that's a huge thing and something that I'm running into this year, which is new working with high school kids. I would argue high school kids need to be even further in shape than college and pro guys. Because if you think
Because they
about
play
most high
multiple
school kids,
positions.
they're two ways.
Yeah.
These high school kids, I mean, maybe it's just Iowa, but there's not a lot of POs that I'm
No.
working with where this guy's a D1 commit pitcher, but when he's not, he's playing shortstop. So think about those 80 extra throws you're making in and out every single day, or the extra whatever doing cuts and relays. Like you are adding on so many more throws than you realize. And actually, I'm not going to say the name, but I had a high school kid wear a sensor at practice one day, and he made 290 throws because he did catch, he did a whole bullpen, and then he like took balls at shortstop, and then he went to the outfield and did practices or practice in the outfield. And I'm like, I didn't realize it was that much, but I knew they had to be more in shape. But I didn't realize the magnitude of like what chronic, workload you're gonna have to be built up for to handle not just pitching, but playing in the field and doing it every single day of practice and games. And it's a grind. I didn't really recognize that with high schoolers until I get into it now, and I had to change kind of the way I program and on ramp guys to really get prepared for that, so they don't spike when the season starts.
For example, and I am going to say the kid's name because I'm going to give him credit for looking into this, but Toby Stevens at Ottawa Hills High School, he is taking on a project right now. There's this really cool project. It's the high school that I went to. When we were juniors in high school, you do this massive project on now it's anything you want pretty much and just trying to make a change. It's a communication project, sources, research. It's awesome. It's kind of like the equivalent of doing a college thesis, but he's doing it in high school and he wants to do it on forearm health in baseball players and how we need to make a
Yeah.
change as a whole. So he's interviewing us about Flex Pro Grip. Heck, he'll probably find a way to reach out to you to talk to you about workloads and stuff. But he asked me about pitch counts because Ohio has this major pitch count rule, and
Mhm.
you can only throw so much in a week. But I guess in Ohio, they only do it during the state tournament, and during the actual season, they really don't care what you do,
Really?
which is asinine and strange to me. Like that
Yep.
just goes way beyond the purpose of this discussion. But he asked me what I thought about pitch counts, and I was just like, they're stupid. And he was like, why are they stupid? And I went through the experiment you just did without pulse or real tracking. I was
Yeah.
just like, Toby, how many throws do you think you make in average practice? He was like, I don't know, like 100 or so. I was like, does that sound like a lot? And he was like, yeah, it does. I was like, okay, well, let's actually go through the math here of how many throws you make. He's like, do you think it's less or more? I was like, Toby, it's like triple. He was like, what? Yeah, like that's nobody realizes how many throws they're making, especially as a normal high school two-way player, which
Mhm.
if you have any shot of being a college baseball player, I'm gonna again throw some astronomical percentage out there, but if you're playing college baseball, I'd assume 97% of college baseball players were two-way players in high school.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. That's probably pretty close.
97 is just our go-to
Yeah,
for the
yeah,
podcast.
that's fine. I do think though with like high school kids, to your point, like I'm not a huge fan of pitch counts either, but I do think it's better than nothing in terms of you can't just look at pitch counts on the days you pitch. Like in
Hmm.
Iowa, you actually have to report the pitch numbers. Like coaches have to sign the whole season, not just the state tournament. But if you can even keep track of the number of throws that you make playing catch, roughly how many throws, like that is better than nothing. But strictly
Big time.
pitch count on the days you pitch, I agree that that is very little value. But again, if you can't afford Pulse and you know it's a substantial investment to do it for a whole team, individual, it's a little bit easier. But keeping track, or even if it's like a time. Hey, I threw for this many minutes today in catch play, and then another 20 minutes of ins and out, whatever it may be. Some data is better than nothing and just guessing and saying, well, I threw 100 pitches today in my start. I'm good. I need 5 days off because that's what the state says, and then I'm good to go. Like that's just a recipe for a lot of potential injuries, I should say, and just not putting the kid's best interest at hand.
Yeah, that's spot on. Some data is better than no data, and the more that you can gather, the better decisions you can make. But I think that's great. Thanks for continuing on that. And yeah, high school is like the Wild West. These kids make so many throws and nobody really knows what's going on.
Hmm.
But I'm gonna put you on the spot a little bit here, so I apologize that I didn't prep you for this ahead of
All
time.
good.
This is one of the things that we are actually spending a lot of time on now with Flex Pro Grip, and it is the idea that if we can measure the important forearm musculature and it is in a good place, the acute to chronic workload ratio might not matter quite as much. What I mean with that, I'll give you some time to kind of process everything. So I'll just keep kind of rambling here. But it's not that a good on ramp doesn't matter. We 100% believe that. What we would contest is that you can get away with a little bit more. So rather than sticking to Gabbitt's research of the like zero point 0.7 to 1.3 range, we
Hmm.
might be able to get comfortable pushing into a 1.4 or a 1.5 if we can show that the forearm musculature, or going even beyond the elbow, if we want to talk about shoulder, if we are strong enough and have enough endurance to handle what that load would be.
Yeah. And before you even said that, that's exactly what I would have said is right now, I think most throwing programs are very universal in terms of the ACR. Every throwing program I've worked with, people I've talked to use that zero point 0.7 to 1.3. But if we can prove that there's an individualized way to either expand or even contract that ACR depending on the actual forearm structure is, I do think that that would be game changing because we could start on ramps earlier for guys that you can't push as much, or we could not necessarily start on ramps later, but we could have more development time for these guys that can push a little bit further. And so that would be game changing as someone who does a lot of programming because obviously for guys that can't push it as much, I need to program a lot further back. They're not going to have as much time to get development in, and on their push days, they're not going to be able to do as much because their ACR would spike. And then for these guys that could handle more, like that would be a dream. I could get plenty more, plenty more development. I could get more like mound build-up time. That would be awesome. But it really, I think there's a lot more room to individualize the throwing program approach more than it currently is. And I do think there's a lot of individuality that you can do between days and your actual workloads and the type of workout you're doing. But that ACR, like I said, I was going to say it if you didn't. If that can be expanded based on how an athlete is built or certain tests or shoulder form, whatever it may be, I think that would be game changing for a lot of teams, individuals, people that program because it opens up a lot of possibilities for further development. And the more you can make that development window, obviously the better that's going to be for the athlete's long-term future.
You handled being put on the spot with that pretty well, I like to think. I mean, we think it's an idea that just can potentially make the industry better. So we're going to continue to try to dig on it. But yes, to date, we at least can figure out arm speeds with something like pulse, or we can do miles per hour and we can keep guys in ranges. But if both you and I went out and went on a throwing program now, I want to say like if we both took our 90 miles per hour, but maybe we'll be a little more realistic and we went out there and said we both took our 76 miles per hour. Our each of our 76, just because we throw the same speed and maybe we even have the same top velocity that we could potentially reach, it
Yeah.
doesn't mean that we're enduring the same stresses in
Yeah.
that given throw. You are
100.
significantly taller than I am. Your levers are longer. Those things can impact the stresses that we experience.
Yeah, yeah, and that's something that is pretty scary when you first start working with Pulse. You can see the torque number that they give you, and a lot of guys think I have a higher torque. That's a bad thing. It's not a bad thing necessarily in and of itself.
No, it
First of
just
all,
is. It's
it just
just a
yeah,
thing.
you've
Yeah.
always thrown with a higher torque most likely, and so your
Yeah.
body is used to that. It's not just a new stress, but it doesn't discount the fact that yes, you're not going to be treated necessarily the same way as someone that's smaller, has shorter leverages, who probably has a lower torque level and they could have a higher workload per throw, if you want to call it that, if you want to get really into the weeds of the actual workload calculation that takes your height and your weight and the actual torque value. You can have a guy that has a 60 torque and a guy that has an 80 torque, and the guy that has a 60 torque could actually have a higher workload per throw because they're just a shorter, less built guy. But again, I've had to reiterate that a lot with especially younger guys. Like just because you're a higher torque guy doesn't mean you're going to get hurt, doesn't mean anything's going to happen like that. But it's the way you're built and the way that you actually, going back to kind of the foundation and on ramp, you just have to be ready to handle any sort of stresses. And even going back to the very beginning of this podcast with the throwing off speed or anything like that, any of the stresses that you are going to come into contact with in the season, you need to start developing those and getting used to those as soon as possible, which again, we've talked about that plenty, but that's part of the individuality and part that I love about coaching.
You talk about lower torque guy versus a higher torque guy. Are you ever making any interventions in your own coaching to try to lower a torque number, or do you just accept that that's a part of who an individual is and use that as you're mapping out a complete throwing schedule?
I can't say I put too much stock into actually looking at the specific, torques and trying to change it. The one thing I will say is if there is a substantial change in the torque, and I know that a guy is normally on a game throws like a 65 torque, and then all of a sudden he drops to maybe a 50 or he spikes up to an 80 for some reason. Like I'll check to make sure the sensor's still in worn the right way, but if it's consistent like that, then we can start to look at some things. Has anything changed substantially? And hopefully, if it's that drastic, it's noticeable by the naked eye that you don't necessarily need a pulse to see it. But in terms of like, I would never try to change a guy's torque just because it's a certain value if it hasn't changed.
I'm glad you answered that way because I didn't want to get in this disagreement zone where we're then fighting back and forth. I I know I said it a little bit earlier. To me, it's one of those things that just is, and you
Mhm.
understand that that's more or less a characteristic of the individual. I don't want to make mechanical changes or movement changes because that's likely either a movement that helps the guy be successful. Why would we want to take him out of it?
Mhm.
Or as we get went into a little bit, anthropometrics that just can't be changed anyways.
Yeah. Yep. I agree with everything that goes into. And I said it freaks out some people when you first start, but the main part is that the person that is programming has to understand it. For a lot of people, if they don't know what they're doing and they just buy a pulse, they might think high torque, yikes, I gotta lower that, and that's gonna lead to a lot of changes in the delivery that might not be very good. And so just having that understanding and having that basic knowledge, which you guys have done a great job covering on the podcast, but just making sure you understand that whoever's programming for you is going to be a huge help.
Well, I think baseball wise, that kind of concludes my line of questioning. I do, if you don't mind, want to get into the human interest side of things and just hear real quick about the engagement.
I would love to get into that.
Yes, all right. So shout out your fiance. Awesome. You don't need to name drop her unless you really want to. I'm happy to hear who she is. I don't know if she's cool with all your newfound fame with you being
No, no,
in
she's cool with it. Shout out Carrie Starbeck. Carrie Starbeck, soon to be Carrie Marchesani. I should say Doctor Carrie
Ooh,
Starbeck.
that's right. Yeah, if you want to tell a quick story, I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, so we were dating for 8 plus years. We
Okay.
started dating junior year of high school. We went to Cedar Falls High School together. I asked her to be my junior prom date, and we started dating shortly after. She is the first girlfriend I ever had, and is the only girlfriend I'm ever gonna have. But she is in Baltimore right now. She's doing a residency in pharmacy at the Johns Hopkins Hospital. So we are kind of doing a distance thing, which we've done for 4 plus years of our relationship. But in terms of like the engagement, there's a little trail in Cedar Falls where we used to walk a lot when we were in high school and even when we were in college and would come back. And there's a little area that has like a gazebo type thing. And so one time when she was back from Baltimore, we went on this walk and I had a whole crew that we would pass this gazebo and it would be completely empty just in case she had any suspicions. Because when you're long distance and you see each other 2 or 3 times a year, and you know that there's probably some sort of proposal coming, it's tough to hide it. But I had a great crew, including her sisters, my brother, his wife, and then our photographer. But walked past the first time there was nothing there, and then we kind of turned around and they'd set everything up and kind of had it all looking good. Credit her sisters for most of that. And then she said yes. And we had a whole party with her family, and that was also a surprise. And it was more of just like thanking a lot of people for keeping it a secret because, like I said, when you're dating someone for 8 plus years, it's really hard to keep a secret from their family and especially her. So she's been awesome about it. And we've been full on wedding planning mode the last few months with the wedding coming up in July. But she's amazing. She is, I think, light years better than me, smarter than me. She's saving lives. I always tell her I just teach people how to throw a ball harder, and she's legitimately saving lives. So she's awesome, and hopefully she ends up with a great career working wherever that may be. Hopefully we find that out soon. But I'm super proud of her.
Well, thanks for sharing that, and thank you, Dr. Carey. Thanks for being a good sport, even though you didn't have much of a choice in hearing that story on the podcast
She'll
today.
love it. She'll love it.
Good. Yeah, in one little side note there, you talk about she's saving lives and you're just trying to make people throw harder. Back at ABCA, I was talking to one of the guys from Driveline and we were talking about some biomechanics stuff, and he was saying how a few years ago, one of the biomechanists from Driveline went to a national biomechanics convention and everybody was saying what they do, and like six straight people spoke, and we are here to help people regain the ability to walk after being paralyzed or stroke victims and all these unbelievable life altering things. And then this guy was like, yeah, we're trying to understand spine tilt and how that impacts bat speed in baseball. And just like, yeah, we always have to remember every once in a while that our little niche game is just a fun little activity on the side.
Yeah, but again, like, and she always tells me this, like, there's been plenty of people that I've helped revive a career, or play a small part in helping them get to where they want to, which that's why I do it. But at the same time, I'm never going to be able to say like, oh yeah, what I'm doing is equally as valuable as what she's doing every day with dealing with everything that she does. I'm very proud, and I'm just not going to be able to touch kind of the impact that she's having in terms of the lives of a lot of people.
Well, once again, Austin, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate you digging into what you do, your passion, and spilling a little bit about the private life, carrying the engagement.
Yeah,
But yeah, it was a ton of fun having you on. I'm sure I'll be bugging you, asking some more questions here and there. And maybe if we need our own Stuff Plus model at some point, we'll just bring you on for that. But
of
yeah,
course.
thanks again. And to everyone out there, thanks for laying back with us.